My name is Sakina Moore. I'm the program director for the Monuments Toolkit project, and I really wanted to welcome you to the San Diego portion of our event for Monument Summer, a season of dialogue, the Cabrillo National Monument. I wanted to introduce you to Bobby Wallace. He is an activist and citizen of the Barona Band of the Mission Indians, and he will be leading us in opening prayer.
I don't think I need a mic. How's everybody doing today? Hopefully everybody's doing good. Welcome to Wai, Wimpayo, Setnayin Maka, Inyat, Bobby Wallace, Nur Ha. I'm glad to be here today, and hopefully the Creator lends us a little hand, in what we're trying to do here. I know we have a little bit of people here, but to make change, I do know that it takes a certain kind of character to make things happen, and whoever's supposed to be here is here right now.
For the live stream.
Oh, okay. Yeah, whoever's here is supposed to be here, and I'm glad you guys are all here. Want to say a little prayer. We're on ancestral lands of our people, our Kumeyaay people. Sometimes our people talk about, as a person or a thing moves from one place to another, kind of leaves a footprint. And that's how I kind of look at it too. My people's DNA has been right here before. Our people's been here since the beginning, and I want to honor that. Creator, thank you for today. Thank you for all of us being here and being alive. Being able to walk here to this building and feel the wind upon our face from the ocean and the storm that's coming. I want to thank Mother Earth for giving us all we need, the food and water, so we can sustain our life. I want to pray to all the animals, everything on Mother Earth, everything, water, rain, thunder, lightning, little bugs, everything, and the things we know of and the things we don't know of. I want to pray to all the people, everybody, good or bad, because we need to show the love to move on in life. And I want us all to pray to ourselves too, that we can have the courage to do the things we must do before we travel to the other side. What? So, this is a place of our people, and I first want to acknowledge Mother Earth right here in Kumeyaay territory. Our people's been walking here since the beginning. And the ancestors that are watching upon us right now, I believe the ancestors are here with us because that's our belief system. I want to pray to them since the first till how we are right here. The whole thing, all of us. We thank this land for taking care of our people, for feeding us, for giving us water. I want to thank the San Diego River because it was our major source. And I want to pray to all the gods that look over us. Nuknawat. So it's pretty good to be here today. I am an activist of some sort. Did a little bit of traveling around here and there and everywhere. I love San Diego. When I go away, it just feels so good to be coming back to the mountains, like when I'm coming up and over the hill, like just to know. And I can feel it. I can feel it right here. I can feel, man, the pressure's easy now because I'm back to my mountains, and this is where our people been. We've been here for 12,000 plus years. But I do know they found Arrowhead. I think they were building the 56, and it was like 120,000 years ago. And that's a long time ago. So is in relation to 12,000 or 120,000, do we know? We might think we know, but really we don't. We're here to talk about the Cabrillo Monument. And for me, as a person from this region, you know, it's kind of, and I want to be soft here. I don't need to speak in a way that's disrespectful. Cabrillo was a mariner. Cabrillo was sailing by and decided to stop. He stopped and said hi, took a couple young people with him. He might have stole them, took off and went that way. And anyways, our people had been out here in our own little boats, our Thule boats. We've been in this water for a long time. You know, everybody had their areas and nobody came into somebody's fishing area. You know, it was all mutual respect. But a conquistador, a statue of one up on top of the black finger or the black earth that overlooks the ocean, to me shouldn't be there. It should be something else, because just maybe mine and his relative and others' relatives sat up there and prayed because it was so high and they could see so far. You know, the Spanish, they traveled all over the place, you know, and by the time he got here, there was word already, you know, because natives run, natives tell things, you know. They had talked about, yeah, there's Ottery people that have been over there, so he knew too. So it's not like this guy discovered anything. This guy was just on his boat, came, and took off that way. So, you know, I do want to speak a little bit more, you know, if time permits, but I enjoy being here today. This is really a big thing. I do want to touch on intergenerational trauma and things that are passed down, and any people that has been put into slavery and rape and all of the cool things that people do wrong to each other. That thing is passed down and it stays within our DNA. And along with that is the mission projects too. It's the same thing. We're having our little kids build little missions and saying it's a good thing, but it's crazy. So anyways, I appreciate your time, everybody. I'll turn this over to Ethan, my cousin. Hey.
And I wanted to introduce you to the World Heritage USA President, Doug Comer, who will make some opening remarks. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, thanks. I just want to say that I think that what you said was very, very important, and I don't want to, this is not part of my prepared remarks, okay? I just want to say it's very important, and you make a lot of incredibly good points. And it reminds me, just very briefly, of a conversation I had with the person who's acting as the Indigenous Heritage Broker for Australia. And I've had some incredible conversations with him. And he said, you know, what you've forgotten is you need to rediscover your kinship. And I thought, well, what is he saying? He said, well, we're kin to all the animal and plant life in the world, and we acknowledge that. Yeah, so he's you know, he went to Brisbane, you know, to fulfill this function, and he doesn't like Brisbane. He wants to be out there in nature, you know, experiencing that, and pretty much what he told me is what you just said. He'd rather be there. And that's what we've lost. I mean, we've lost that connection to nature. Now, I'm an archaeologist, so I'll admit that, okay? And I'm not going to try to excuse what other archaeologists have done. And maybe when I was much, much younger, I used to dig, but I don't dig anymore. I use remote sensing because it's not intrusive, and we want to understand the interrelationship between humans and the environment that indigenous people have known forever, and we've just ignored the fact that we are, in fact, all kin, not just with other people, but with every species and every form of life on Earth. And I think we've just lost that, and I think we see where that's leading us now. So I hear you. Yeah, thank you for saying that. And then I'll go back to my prepared comments, but thank you. So first of all, I'm just very happy to be here. I'm going to put my glasses on because I've got notes here. And I'm really hoping that this will initiate a close collaboration with everybody in this room, especially acknowledging what you just said, and an ongoing exchange of ideas with everybody in this room. So my name is Douglas Comer, and I'm president of World Heritage USA. Now, World Heritage USA is the supporting domestic organization, just to identify that, of the United States National Committee of the International Council on Monuments and Sites. And I'm also president of that. ICOMOS advises UNESCO on cultural issues by virtue of the World Heritage Convention. That's an international treaty that now has been signed by more countries than any other international treaty in the world. And we ignore it a lot. The United States was actually, it seems strange now under these political conditions, but the United States was the driving force behind the final draft and the ratification of the World Heritage Convention back in 1972. So the world's changed a lot politically since then. And our national committee, the U.S. National Committee, was the first of what are now 107 national committees. So we have that. We have this network of international organizations that we're very much a part of. So, being that we're the International Council on Monuments and Sites, we've always been involved with monuments, but now in a new way, in a better way, I think. Last year, and Sakina will probably talk about this or has, we were awarded from the Mellon Foundation a grant to research practices related to monuments associated with oppression. And since then, we formed the Monuments Team. The Monuments Team, headed by Sakina. The team and our national committee are now deeply engaged in advising and developing a monuments toolkit. And I'm going to just read very quickly some of the objectives that we've identified. So we would like to research case studies that examine instances of organizations and governments addressing monuments of oppression from around the world. And believe me, we've had massive response from other parts of the world. Develop guidelines for determining the alternatives for the disposition of monuments associated with oppression and choosing among them in transparent and ethical ways. And then, of course, developing the training materials that will be needed to assist local leaders and advocacy groups in applying the guidelines. So here we are in the West Coast. Actually, I spent a good bit of time in San Diego growing up, so it's like coming home for me. And we had an East Coast event about a month ago, I think it was. So this is our summer event, and again, it's led by Program Manager Sakina Moore. And she is also engaged with sites and people all across the United States, not just in Charleston, which was the East Coast event, but in many, many, many places. She and her team have done that. And also, we've been in greater and greater contact with other countries of the world to find ways to deal with monuments or look at the ways they've dealt with monuments. And I'm going to say, there's a lot of interest in this. There's enormous interest. We started this, I think, partly, in large part because of the Black Lives Matter movement, which became a global movement. And now, just about every country in the world is grappling with the issues that the Black Lives Movement raised. Monuments are inanimate objects. They have no voices. But nonetheless, they speak in a very, very powerful way. Now, I mentioned as an archaeologist, I'm also really an anthropologist by training. I did my dissertation on ritual. And part of that was to say monuments convey ideas in solid form. They're made of materials, typically, that are clearly intended to last forever. In this form, they make the claim that they are eternal expressions of what is normal and natural in the world. They tell us this. By not using words, what those monuments proclaim so loudly does not invite discussion, the kind of discussion we want to begin now. And these monuments become waypoints. They become waypoints that people use as they make their way through life. What's normal? What's natural? How should I behave? They look for these little beacons, little waypoints as they make their way through life. And it becomes a way to transmit heritage. That's often has been the heritage of oppression. You know, I'm from Baltimore. I used to drive by a statue of Stonewall Jackson and Robert E. Lee across from the Baltimore Museum of Art, and one day I'm driving by and I hear people say, this is about heritage, not hate. Well, it's about the heritage of hate, in my opinion. We intend to create a new heritage. We want to try. We all have to work together to do that draws lessons from that heritage, that use of heritage. So this new heritage must include voices from groups that have been excluded and exploited. How can you learn from the past if you ignore what other human beings in the past have learned from their experience of life in the past? This would be a heritage. There's a lot of applications to this. A heritage that celebrates and promotes social justice. And also a heritage that drives action toward goals that are closely related to social justice, including climate change, achieving the 2030 UN Development Goals. And I just spoke to the UN about that, heritage and the relationship between heritage and achieving the UN the 2030 UN Development Goals. And especially, I think, very important, learning from indigenous knowledge holders. We just ignored that. We just put that aside. We've lost our way. I'm a scientist. You know, I like to do research. I like data. I analyze data and all that. But we're ignoring knowledge that has been accrued over thousands of years, and we're ignoring or we're leaving behind the sense of connectedness that indigenous knowledge holders have had, and that is going to bring us down if we don't stop doing it. So anyway, my comments, and I just want to again express my hope that we can all work together toward making things a little bit better. Thanks, Mike.
Thank you, Doug. Hello again. This is again Sakina Moore, and thank you very much for your insight and your comments. And I wanted to introduce why we're here today. And so again, my name is Sakina Moore. I'm the program director of the Monuments Toolkit Project of World Heritage USA. And as I stated before, we're here because of a global movement that was sparked by a murder of a man who was just trying to live his everyday life, and at the hands of police violence. And that action sparked a global movement where we were seeing what monuments are there, and how does that even reflect us as a society? So we saw a global a global movement to tear down monuments to Cecil Rhodes, who was the harbinger for apartheid in South Africa. We saw statues come down who honored Robert E. Lee, who was a Confederate, who was a part of the Confederacy. So in the milieu of all of that, we did, as Doug mentioned, we received a generous grant from the Mellon Foundation, and we just wanted to thank them for their support, because we wouldn't be here today without their support. And so with the grant, we were able to look at best practices around the world of how communities are handling monuments of oppression and contentious monuments. So it is our hope that the toolkit will help guide communities that deal with these types of monuments. And they want to deal with it, but they just don't know how to start. So it is our hope that we can bridge the global community through the common challenges so that we can also see common threads. So threads that are happening here in California, threads that are even related to what's happening in the state of, in the country of Georgia, even going to as far to Japan, of how communities are dealing with these types of monuments. And again, it is our hope to see that, to bridge us as a community, as a global community, to glean ideas from each other and to see the possibilities of what can be done. So during the past 2 years, the Monuments Toolkit team conducted research around the world, and including throughout the United States as well, to understand the complexity of monuments and why they are problematic and oppressive. So as we embarked on the research, we did find 7 possible outcomes for monuments. So it's all going to come together. So we came up with 7 possible permutations, and that would be removal, relocation, recontextualization, reinterpretation, repurposing, co-location, destruction, and the status quo. And I'll give you definitions of that in a little bit. And one of the things that we did find is that even with these definitions, it is a little bit of a framework of what can possibly happen. Some things happen at the same moment. Some things are just a way station for others. But we just thought that these were really interesting themes. So removal is so obvious, right? The act or the process of extracting the monument from its original location. The monument exists in its original form, however, it's not accessible to the general public. So i.e. it's removed from the original site and is put in off-site storage. Another example that we saw was relocation. So relocation is the act of placing the monument in an alternate setting. The alternate setting is not the original location, and the monument retains its original meaning, and the general public has access to it. So for instance, a monument is removed from a public space and put into and replaced to a cemetery. Another example would be reinterpretation and recontextualization. So that is the act of transforming the significance of the monument, and the original monument may or may not be located in its original location. So an example of this would be adding interpretive materials to provide additional insight to the monument. Another example is repurposing the monument. So it's basically changing the basic DNA of a monument. So melting it down to its core and transforming it into something completely different. And an example of that would be the Swords to Plowshares project in Charlottesville, Virginia. Another example that we saw was the act or co-location, which is the act of adding additional monuments to temper the meaning or the significance of the monument. So it would be just adding another counter monument to again tell the whole story. And then we also saw destruction. So that is basically taking the monument and just obliterating it with no intent of ever it seeing light of day again. And then last is status quo. Even though it's not ideal, it also is always an option. Inaction is always an option, not ideal. So that's how we define the status quo. And that's not doing anything with the monument and just allowing it to exist without intervention. And the reason why I wanted to give all these definitions is because through this, what we're going to be discussing today is a perfect example of the frameworks. And we're looking at it through the lens of recontextualization and reinterpretation. Museums have are the keepers of community memory. And so after the removal of contentious and oppressive monuments, the museum has become the space for that. And we're going to be looking at this through the lens of the Cabrillo National Monument. So that's why we're here today. So what I wanted to do was introduce you to our panelists. We have panelists who are going to give you a greater background of why the Cabrillo National Monument is problematic, and then also have the perspective of the museum of what happens when you, as a space to, again, process these monuments, because they are a big source of they're a reminder of trauma and intergenerational trauma. And as a museum, as a keeper of memory, what is the changing role to help facilitate those conversations? So on that note, I wanted to just go through the biographies, the short biographies of our panelists. So forgive me, I don't want to put you on the spot, but but I just wanted to give you a brief background before they go up and give the presentation. Before you came in today, we were we gave you a slip of paper if you wanted. So if you have any questions that came up during the presentation, you'll be able to ask that. And William, just raise your hand and just make sure William gets your slip of paper. So I wanted to introduce you to Ethan Benegas. Ethan is a descendant of the Kumeyaay Luisenyo Pauamakiam, and if I'm not getting the pronunciation right, stop me. Okay. Thanks. He is the co-owner of Kumeyaay.com and historian of the San Diego History Center, which operates the Junipero Serra Museum. He taught history within the Grossmont Cayumaca College District, which is also Kumeyaay College, for 5 years, and currently teaches at the San Diego State University. He served on the board of directors at the Kumeyaay Community College and Barona Museum, and he was first published in 2017 in Indian Gaming in Kumeyaay Nation, and in 2020 published Kumeyaay Oral History Project, a community-based research project after collecting 31 personal interviews, videotaped oral histories, and photographs from San Diego's first people. Through this project, Benegas collected the voice of the Kumeyaay people, giving a voice to the voiceless. And so I would just want to add that this is a big part of our project, is also to give voice and have that seat at the table of communities that were long denied that space. So again, I just wanted to thank you, and Ethan, why don't you come up, and I'll introduce you when you come up too. Okay.
I think that was my water. Thank you. Sorry, I had my water blocking everyone's face. Good afternoon, everyone. My name's Ethan Benegas. I'm also English and Scottish. My mother's here. Thanks, Mom. I'm also from the Barona Reservation, Barona Band of Mission Indians. My cousin Bobby Wallace, the same tribe. And I want to acknowledge my professor, Iris Ingstrom, who taught me everything I know on Spanish history at USD. I'm in a unique position. I've always had my feet in both worlds, the Indian world and the non-Indian world. So I'm uniquely positioned to have this conversation. And I want to say, first of all, that everyone sees this monument differently. And that's the hard part. We're different than the Civil War issues going on, where it's kind of clear, right? It's like, okay, slavery's bad, you know. So there's not much of a dialogue there. There's some people that, obviously fight that. But here it's more the West Coast is much more different because, to be honest, no one really knows the history. And that's really what I'm after today, is to teach you the history so you can form your own opinion. And that's kind of my teaching pedagogy, how I teach. I try to, persuade you by giving you the knowledge, not telling you how to think. So I'm going to do that today as best as I can. As you mentioned, I teach at San Diego State in the American Indian Studies Department. I taught at Kumeyaay College for 5 years, specializing in Kumeyaay history. And after visiting monuments and museums all up and down California, and teaching a dozen college courses, I noticed something very unique in California, and that's that Spanish history takes precedence over all other histories. And I know a lot of folks see that too, right, with the mission stuff, and like my cousin brought up earlier. This mission's history is the primary thing that matters in a lot of our histories, in our monuments, in our museums, and also our especially our 4th grade curriculum, right? That's number one. So I want to introduce a concept in ethnic studies and in American Indian studies called settler colonialism. This is a concept that is very important, especially for America, but also it has implications for Spanish history too. So settler colonialism is when a foreign settler occupies and resides on land already inhabited by indigenous people. Settler colonialism causes displacement, replacement, depopulation, reduction, assimilation, and sometimes genocide. Settler colonialism would shift, affect, and shape American history through the 21st century, erasing the memory and history of indigenous peoples of the United States. Should have been a capital P right there. And this is an important concept because settler colonialism is about erasing people. And on top of that, you create an entire new space as if no one lived there before. And in a nutshell, that's how Indian people feel. We don't see ourselves in monuments, in history books. And I'll cover that a little later. But we need to answer these questions as a group, as a consensus, as a community. First, why are we celebrating this history? And that why is very important. And also, who is telling this story? So those are the two questions I want to keep in mind as we go forward. So just a brief history of Spanish colonization of California. So from the native perspective, it's the East, again, the East is different than the West. We have this different chapter opening much later. And we, contrary to popular belief, Christopher Columbus did not discover a new world. Now, we had a very old world with ancient civilizations, the Mayans, the Incans, the Olmecs, who were predecessors to the Aztecs. And you have these ancient civilizations with populations very similar to Europe at this time. For example, in Canada and United States, there was 18 million indigenous people inhabiting this space. And one of the things that bothers me historically, and many of you may not know this, is that Christopher Columbus and Vasco Núñez de Balboa never saw the shores of America. And yet we name our universities, we name our rivers, our streets, and our towns, and this very park after Spanish explorers that never were even here. And that's something that really bothers me personally. And one of the things that I want to bring up about Cabrillo that indigenous people think is he was actually a conquistador first. So when he came here, he was an explorer. So it's important to understand the nuances in history. That's the hardest part about history. It takes a lot of time and effort and energy to understand the nuances and the differences. It's not black and white. But when Cabrillo in 1519, with Hernan Cortez, he sacked and destroyed Tenochtitlan, which was the Aztec civilization. So Cabrillo at first was a soldier, a conquistador. So that's from the native perspective, that's how we think. However, when he arrived here in 1542, he was an explorer. He was only here for 4 to 5 days. And there's a couple different versions of that encounter, right? Some of them mention that he took Indian children. Others mention it was a friendly encounter. Nothing happened. And he was just exploring and leaving, and he was looking for a safe passage on the West Coast. So there's a couple different versions, and that's where it gets challenging. You have to understand the nuances and the different stories. And sometimes you can't find you can't come to a consensus on that. So 23 years later, after taking Tenochtitlan, he lands in San Diego, Cabrillo right here. So here he is in the San Salvador. And I want to mention, this is actually my professor's slides, so thank you, Professor. So couldn't have done it without you. And then we have Sebastian Vizcaino. So he was here after Cabrillo, and Cabrillo named it San Miguel, and then Sebastian Vizcaino erased his name and called it San Diego. So he changed the name in 1602. He was the second Spanish explorer here, and that's one of the first maps we have of San Diego, the harbor. And then, but one of the things that also, again, bothers me in that spirit of settler colonialism is that, like my cousin said, we already had names here. We had Kumeyaay names for everything. So a lot of names actually that you know of in San Diego are Kumeyaay names: Hamishaw, Cuyamaca, La Jolla. These are all Kumeyaay names that were changed to sound Spanish, to blend into society. And another one is Hamul, Poway. Those were villages that were changed to sound more Spanish and I guess English too. So again, in the spirit of settler colonialism, all of our place names were erased, in addition to our histories. And then it would be really, the story of California starts in 1769 with the sacred expedition of Portola and Father Serra, and 2 separate expeditions, an overland and an overseas expedition, where they landed in San Diego on July 1st, 1769. So this was 227 years after Cabrillo and 167 years after Vizcaino. So this is when Spanish colonization officially started. And there's much more on that. But I want to mention another place marker that really, I actually sent this to my tribal council a couple years ago. So I'm a historian here and at the Serra Museum, and I remember walking around the Serra Museum and I read this, and my heart sank. And again, so one of the things it says is that Father Serra was the very first citizen here in 1769, and he planted civilization. So if you look at those red squares, and this is still up, and maybe this is what we can work on next. But this is to honor Father Serra, and there's so many undertones, right? Planted civilization, first citizen. So basically, again, settler colonialism, right? Nothing mattered before. And that's really how this language affects Indian people. And that's kind of what my cousin talked about, historical trauma. This creates trauma for Indian people. This is not empowering in any sense of the word. So the mission started in 1769. This is San Diego mission, and again, this is kind of really what takes precedence in San Diego history, early history. It's very challenging, again. Mostly it's taught and learned through mission records, through Spanish records, and Indian testimony and oral history is not really considered. And that's really what my specialty is I'm an oral historian. So the question for me is, it's really more important for what my elders think and what my tribe thinks than what I think. And I always try to put my tribe, and when I do these things, I bring my tribe with me, and not just the ones that are alive, but the ones that are gone. And I bring my ancestors with me. And it's really hard to find that consensus. So, to be honest, when I talk to them about Spanish colonization, most know very little. And that's probably a product of our schools and the schools they went through. They went to the same schools as you did, right? And we're not really taught our history. In fact, Kumeyaay College is very new, and it's relatively like 20 years old. So we're at the precipice of something different. But this is actually a story. So when my dad passed away in 2018, he didn't really talk about his life very much. And I learned most about my dad after he passed. After people would come to me and say, hey, your dad did this, your dad did that. He was at Alcatraz, you know. I never knew my dad was at Alcatraz. And this is another story that my aunt told me, because she found out I was doing this work. And she told me that one day my dad came home with a folder on his, I was probably in 4th grade, right, of a conquistador. And my great-grandmother yelled at him and said, get that out of my house. They used to chop off our heads. And that was a very powerful moment for me, you know. And one of the things that I learned was we had these stories in our past for a reason. I call them the boogeyman, right? You always warn your kids about the bad people in your life. And so it was a visceral experience she had of the conquistadors, and I don't know exactly the details, but if she told him to get that folder out of her house. Moving on. So one of the things that I wanted to mention earlier before I get started is that in this new chapter in American history, every part of our society needs representation. And it's a vital imperative to include the voice of the indigenous people when we're discussing these things. Now is the time to tell our story in a more modern and less biased point of view. And to end my presentation, I want to share a couple stories I had from the Kumeyaay Oral History Project. So when I talked to Pat Crow, he's from our reservation, he had a powerful experience. So again, it's different. Every elder was different. A lot knew very little, and some knew a lot, and others in between. But he compared, and this is actually normal in American Indian studies, the Spanish to the Nazis, to Hitler. And he mentioned that it was, you know, that's what he thinks of when he thinks of Spanish colonization. He thinks of the Nazis and Hitler. I mean, everyone compares things to Hitler nowadays, right? But I think when they do, it's a little more real. So there's multiple perspectives. That was kind of one of the most interesting or most profound reactions. Another one was Danny Tucker from Sequan. So he was the chairman for during the gaming years for 30 years. And when he talked about the Spanish, he talked about their desire for domination. He talks about when Christopher Columbus came here and put that thing down in the stupid ground with that cross on it and said, now this belongs to Spain, this belongs to the Spanish people, this is, and you go out, and anybody who is not Christian, it's okay to have domination over these people. That's what they did to us, and they dominated us, and at times they dominate us to this day. Another one is the Christmans from Viejas. One of the things that Ron said was that he learned, and this, you know, again, there's so many nuances to this work, that one of the things he learned was that the Spanish did this to their own people, the way they treated us, and it wasn't very nice, right? And you can go all the way back to the Roman Empire when they were conquered by the Romans. They were actually indigenous people at one point, right? So that trauma carried on, and I think that's what I'd like to teach when I'm in my classes, that they weren't always like that. But one of the things Ron said is that, you know, he learned that this is how they treat their own people, but you can't treat our people like that. It doesn't make it okay to treat us like that. Oh, that's my time. That's my time. Yeah, all right, right on the button. So again, what matters to me is that you answer these questions, not me. I'm just here to give you some information, and hopefully we can reach a consensus. And the last thing I want to say is that it's important, everyone's perspective matters. Everyone's perspective matters, especially those that don't agree with you. And I think it's important as we move forward to include everyone and listen. And so thanks for having me, and I appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you, Ethan. And I just also wanted to let you know that at the end of the presentations, we all have a question and answer period. So we'll have a moderated discussion. But if you do have questions, we did give everyone a slip of paper so you can ask the question that you have for any of the panelists. And we'll do our best to get to your question during that period. So William Humphrey, who is sitting in the back, he's just stepped out of the room, but he'll be back. And I'll also highlight him again. We'll be able to take your questions. So we talked about the greater history of the Kumeyaay and what does this monument, what does it represent? And it is, as you know, it's that harbinger of oppression. But what happens when you have a museum in that museum space, and what happens when the museum becomes the custodian of these types of monuments? So what happens afterwards? So I wanted to invite Jason Hansen, who did just that, who was working with the Union Soldier statue in Denver, Colorado. So just to introduce you to Jason, Jason is the Chief Creative Officer and Director of the Interpretation and Research at History Colorado. Since joining the organization in 2016, he has led the development of numerous exhibitions on subjects including Colorado history and 100 objects, beer in the New West, the Negro Leagues, and the Western American art, and Colorado's toppled Civil War monument. He serves as the executive producer of the museum's acclaimed Lost Highways podcast and oversees publication of the Colorado Magazine, which is the state's journal of record since 1923. He has written widely about Colorado history on topics such as the role of monuments in society, the origins of modern workplace, and what we will remember about 2020. I think that everybody's doing that. And I think that's very, very important because it was a ground-setting year. Gender roles in utopian communities, environmental history, baseball and beer, and in 2022 he edited an anthology of essays about Denver entitled "Is this a city that we imagined?" And he also works closely with the State Historians Council as the Deputy State Historian, and prior to joining History Colorado, he was the member of the research faculty at the Center of the American West at CU Boulder. Again, welcome, Jason. Thanks.
I should have really trimmed down that introduction. Sorry, everyone. Hi, thank you so much, friends, for having me here all the way from Colorado. I am always grateful to get an invitation to San Diego, so thank you. As you heard, I'm pretty much all Colorado these days. That's just part of the gig. But what's not in my bio is that I lived in Sacramento in 4th grade, and I built my mission out of Play-Doh, and I remember it very clearly. As a 4th grader, I hadn't thought about it actually until probably an hour ago. But it's now I'm thinking a lot about why did we do that and the ramifications of it. It's really interesting. I also, I just got back from a trip to Colombia and Peru and Mexico City, and seeing with my own eyes for the first time the way some of these histories of colonization are presented in those places and interpreted. And that's not what I'm going to talk about today, but it's something that I'd be happy to talk about at the reception or anything else. It was fascinating and eye-opening. What I am going to talk about, I'm the guy who's here to provide the case study. I was really, I didn't know much about Cabrillo before I got this invitation, and I, did what every good scholar does. I jumped on Wikipedia and read all about him, and then also Balboa, just for good measure. But that's a different story than the one that we have to tell and explore out in Colorado. These are different contexts, certainly. And so I'm going to talk about a controversial Civil War monument in Denver, but not the kind you are used to hearing about. This is On Guard. As Sakina mentioned, it's a Union soldier memorial. This is a memorial to the Union, so it's not one of those Lost Cause Confederate monuments you may have heard about being torn down all across the country. It was created by an artist who was himself a veteran of the Civil War, fought with Colorado's troops, including in one very consequential battle that doesn't get enough recognition, the Battle of Glorieta Pass, where Colorado troops stopped an invading force of Confederates who were trying to capture the Colorado goldfields and then march on to California, hoping to divert all of the wealth that was funding the Union War effort to the Confederate rebellion. And history might have looked much differently if they had not been successful in turning them back at the border between Colorado and New Mexico. He was also a trained artist. He studied in Paris, and he created this sculpture toward the end of his career. It is a composite portrait. He said all along that it was not of anyone in particular. It was a composite portrait of the cavalrymen in his unit during the Civil War. It was installed in 1909, and it stood guard in front of the state capitol through snowstorms, like this whopper we had in Denver where we got 4 feet in 1913, through the lesser snowstorms that we get today, speaking of climate change. And its prominent position on the west steps of the state capitol in Denver's Civic Center Park meant that it has been a focal point for all kinds of gatherings over the years. I'm going to mention Super Bowl gatherings and Stanley Cup gatherings and all of our Titletown celebrations in Denver, but also protests. This is where people have come to express their opinions and call for change over the years, whether that is the Women's March, immigration rallies, Chicano movement rallies that you see in the pictures here today, or any slew of other types of protests. They have tended to center on guard, including the summer of 2020. In the wake of George Floyd's murder and the international outrage over it and calls for racial justice, this is where Coloradans came from across the state to make their voices heard. You can see On Guard standing there in the center of a crowd. Our museum is actually about 2.5 blocks away from here, so we had teams of curators out documenting the events as long as it was safe for them to do so, and one of our curators took this photo. So you can see, maybe to a degree, maybe to a greater degree than previous protests, the statue itself became part of the protest. People were tagging it with different messages. People were leaving signs on it, presumably when they left for the day, but wanted people to continue to see the message that they were trying to send. Until, that is, the night of June 25th, when we woke up in Denver to find out that it had been toppled by unknown actors in the night. To this day, we still don't know officially who toppled it. It is, no one's come forward to claim responsibility. No investigation that I know of has identified any responsible parties. And so you may be thinking to yourself, why was this monument controversial? This is not that lost cause monument. This is not a monument to a conquistador. This is, a monument to people who fought in a war that ultimately ended the enslavement of black men and women throughout the United States. Why was it toppled? To answer that question, we need to consider how the Civil War in the West was different in some really important respects than the Civil War in the East that we all tend to learn about. Most people, I think, tend to learn their Civil War history stops at the Mississippi. But it did come out west, as I mentioned, with the Battle of Glorieta Pass and some others. And while there were legit battles, like the Battle of Glorieta Pass, in which the Union troops protected the gold fields and the silver fields in Nevada and here in California, the troops weren't there just to hold the gold out west. They were actively engaged in removing tribes from their homelands as part of the National Settlement Project. Remember that during the Civil War, we also have the passage of the Homestead Act, and the Transcontinental Railroad is being built. People are actively being encouraged to move west from the East Coast, and the way that the government is clearing land for people to claim under the Homestead Act is by using troops to remove tribes and confine them to reservations. The most ignominious episode of that colonial project, certainly in Colorado and potentially throughout the West, was the Sand Creek Massacre. November 29th, 1864, Union Army troops attacked a peaceful camp of Cheyenne and Arapaho people, mostly women and children and the elderly. At the time, they were camped under assurances of protection from the United States Army. That did not stop the attack from coming. Ultimately, 230 or more of them were killed that morning, mostly running for their lives, shot down or cut down from behind. And then the troops paraded back to Denver with trophies and souvenirs, including body parts of the dead taken from the battlefield. It's horrific and gruesome, and in the midst of the Civil War, the Army was quick to take time out from the other things it was doing and investigate and issue a report declaring it a massacre, unjust and dishonorable, in 1865, so less than a year after it happened. Congress followed shortly thereafter with its own report coming to the same conclusion. But the people of Denver had a hard time accepting that their friends and family and loved ones had participated in something so dishonorable, and they continued to litigate that it hadn't been a massacre, that it had been a legitimate battle, just like Glorieta Pass. And one of the ways that they tried to make their case was with On Guard. If you look at the plaque that was affixed to the base of it, you may have trouble reading it, so I'll zoom in for you. On the bottom there's a list of battles and engagements that Coloradans fought in during the Civil War for the Union. And if you look at that very last one, it says Sand Creek, Colorado, 1864. So they're making the case here that it's the Battle of Sand Creek, not the Sand Creek Massacre. And that is a case that people continued to make for generations. There were protests over the years. You can notice that somebody tried to grind it off at one point. Red paint was splashed on it. Until around the turn of the century, Colorado's legislature was actually prepared to remove that plaque and put up a new one that didn't include it. And at the request of the Cheyenne and Arapaho, the descendants of those who were present at Sand Creek, instead, they placed a new plaque. They wanted to leave that plaque as a reminder of the story that had been told, and then placed a new plaque that said in unambiguous terms that it was a massacre, not a battle. But that kind of augmentation, which I know is one of the paths that World Heritage USA has identified, it rarely seems to satisfy people. And there were still complaints about the monument until it was finally toppled on at the end of June. And so we come back to him lying unmonumentally in the flower bed there. And he was unmonumentally secreted away on the back of a flatbed truck to a secure storage facility by Colorado's National Guard. Nobody was sure what to do with him. And so History Colorado, I reached out and said, hey, while everyone's thinking about what to do with them, we had been hearing, pundits in the media saying, these controversial monuments belong in museums. And I thought, good idea, let's do that. And so I reached out and I said, hey, while everyone's thinking about what to do with them, History Colorado would be a good place to keep it safe and maybe to create a constructive experience around this. We'd like to try. And the Capitol Building Advisory Committee agreed, and we installed it at History Colorado in October, just a few months after it had been toppled. We installed it at the base of a staircase, the grand staircase in our museum, because I really wanted to make sure that we're mostly looking up at monuments. Monuments are always larger than life. So we very intentionally put it in the staircase so that you could look at it at eye level. You can see it from any angle, including the pigeon's view that I like the best. And then we set about interpreting it. And this is the installation from ground level. We interpreted it in 3 phases, and this is where I thought we would be able to find best practices from other museums. Surely, with so many people in the media saying, hey, this is where these controversial monuments belong, somebody would have figured out, well, this is how you put them in a museum. But we looked around and we could not find an example of a museum putting an actual controversial monument on public display. We found some of people putting it in storage or making it appointment-only viewing, but not on public display. And so we had to invent the playbook, and we have, fortunately, a really talented exhibits team. We worked together. We came up with a 3-phase interpretation. Phase 1, which you can see on the little sign there, you can't read it, but I'll tell you what it says, was about the actual events that this monument was meant to commemorate. In this case, Colorado's troops fighting for the Union in the Civil War, including removing tribal people from their homelands. Second phase, when the monument was installed, what were the circumstances? I mentioned this was installed in 1909. For those of you who have been paying attention to the debates around Civil War monuments, you may notice that that is a time when many of these Civil War monuments were installed. In fact, the first couple decades of the 1900s, the greatest explosion of monuments in American history. That has a couple of reasons. One, the generation that fought in the Civil War was passing away, and people wanted to honor them. This is something that we're familiar with today. We just lived through this with World War II vets, and it resulted in a big monument on the National Mall. But also, that desire to litigate, and the fact that Denver was embarrassed that we didn't have a Civil War monument, and there was a big convention coming to town of veterans, and so we needed something. And then the third phase was going to be, what does this mean today? And we realized immediately that the days of museums getting to be the omniscient voice of community hegemony are long since over. Museums don't get to say what things mean today. So we reached out and we asked people, all the people we could think of, tribal representatives, veterans, artists, activists, historians, and we made their feelings the interpretation that you see around it. We heard that it was a tribute to veterans. We heard that it was a reminder of atrocities against indigenous people. We heard that it was a symbol of white supremacy and injustice. We heard that it was a casualty of destructive lawlessness during the protests. We heard all kinds of things, and we just put them up in the words of the people who said them. But we didn't want the conversation to end there. Just because we were able to reach out to a few people didn't mean that that was all the meanings there were. And so we wanted the conversation to continue, and we invited people to answer those 2 questions. Do we need monuments? What do you think their purpose should be? Doug said that monuments don't typically invite discussion, but in a museum they can. And what we found is that this was the best part of the exhibition by far. You see all of the Post-it notes. I don't know why museums love Post-it notes, but we do, and so we did this with Post-it notes. If I zoom in, you see tiny print, detailed arguments answering these questions, sometimes pointing from one Post-it note to another to have a sort of chain conversation. What we found was we kept track of these. We still keep track of these because we're a museum. Far and away, the most popular sentiment was that monuments are important social memory and that people were uncomfortable with them being censored by being taken away. Whether they were for better or for worse, they were important social memory and we could learn from them. We also heard, this is in descending order, from a contingent of people who thought they were important but weren't really comfortable with them being on display, didn't want them destroyed, didn't want them censored, but wanted them in places like museums. Then we heard from much smaller contingents of people, one of whom said monuments are inherently white supremacist in America today, and all of them should be removed, that we should not have any. And finally, the smallest group thought that we should remove the ones that are bummers and keep the ones that are inspirational to us, that the point of monuments is to inspire us. See, don't erase history. Oh, I'm not quite ready to thank you yet. I'm still thinking about that. No, I just want to wrap up. My time is up here. I think Doug put it really eloquently at the beginning of our time here together that monuments are attempts to hand down knowledge and inspiration, and probably most importantly of all when we're talking about history, claims on identity, claims about who we are together, from one generation to the future. I think they're mostly created in good faith, not always, but mostly, because one generation thinks that these are stories worth remembering, that will guide us and will inspire us to do the right thing going forward. They are ways of encapsulating social knowledge that don't need language. But they also, by their very nature, hand down the flaws of their subjects. And sometimes, as values change, as new information comes to light, as just the way we think about things changes over time from one generation to the next, those flaws can seem to overwhelm the good in that message or the good intent of that message. And when they no longer serve us, I think the people, who are, by the way, the keepers of all of our history, we, the people, we have the right, understandably so, to seek out new monuments that are going to serve us better. I'm going to leave it there, and happy to answer any questions in the Q&A. Thank you. Now,
Thank you, Jason. And again, everyone will have we're going to have a Q&A. And if you have any questions for the panelists, you're given a slip of paper. Please feel free to give them to William. William, raise your hand. If you have any questions, we'll do our best to make sure that your questions are answered. I wanted to again thank you. Again, we have this great having a full circle and thinking about how we think about monuments and what can possibly happen, and how everything is crowdsourced. It's a community effort, right? To think about how we are to going forward, how we're going to be dealing with monuments, and how and what happens if like making and calling our monuments to be representative of us in its totality. So I wanted to invite Ethan Benegas and Jason Hansen to the front of the room, and we're just going to do a little panel discussion, and I will moderate the discussion.
you can come join us.
Yes.
sensitive mics.
Okay, so I'll do my best to avoid this situation, which is called the feedback. Yeah.
Just one mic.
Okay, sure, you could do one mic and I'll just,
Does that have the
Hand
approval
off.
of the people in the back of the room? All right.
does it work for everybody? Oh, wait, was my mic turned off? Or if whoever's not speaking can turn off the mic so we can, okay.
I got a live one here.
All right, I think this works.
Okay.
So again, this is just it's a loaded topic. There's a lot to digest here, right? So this is just a conversation for things that, again, to get ideas about what are the possibilities, what can happen. And again, if you have questions, make sure that you send them to William, and we'll do our best to answer them, even if he's waving his hand back. So I wanted to just, and the questions I will ask it's just open to everybody. So if you have something that it might be pointed, but then it might be something that you could say, hey, look, I want to answer this as well, so I want to make sure that you have that opportunity as well. So, it's so interesting because I'm from the, full disclaimer, from the East Coast, and I imagine that our audience is from all parts of the world, and also throughout the United States who are tuning in to us today. So, spoiler alert, we're also being live streamed. Hi, everybody. And one of the things that was very interesting that Ethan, that you said in your presentation, was that that cultural heritage is different in the West than it is in the East. And I think that's very loaded, and I think that it's something that we don't really understand, and I just wanted to know if you could speak to that a little bit more.
Can you
That you said
restate
that,
that question?
that cultural heritage is different in the West than it is in the East, or
Mhm.
just historic preservation, or just history in general. So I just wanted to see
Yeah.
if you could just explain that a little
Yeah.
bit more.
Okay. First, I want to touch on what you first said, and is my sister here still? She left. But one thing, my brother's a bartender downtown for a long time, and one of the things he said is that everyone from San Diego is not from San Diego, right? Can you feel me on that? And so we have an issue with that, and so historically, there's we have a lot of work to do, history-wise. As far as the differences with the East and the West, so as I said in that past slide, in 1769, Father Sarah came here. That was first contact. That was our Plymouth Rock, if you will, where, an incredible moment in his time where our people, the Kumeyaay people, met the Spanish, and you had many different variations of reactions. It was very complicated. And so in 1769, it was only a few years later when you had the United States form the Republic. And so most people don't put those two things together. So our history, you hear it often, it starts in, even Indian people, 1492. That's when colonization happened. So there's a lot of things that need to be cleared up with the nuances and the complexities when you compare the East and the West. And it's very unique and very different. There's a lot of similarities, but they often are not appreciated. The differences aren't appreciated when it comes to what our experience with colonization versus the East Coast.
Thank you. And one of the things I thought was very interesting, we were talking about cultural trauma, about intergenerational trauma, and one of the things that really struck out was we were talking about your aunt and how you had the folder, and she's like, get that out of there, yeah. and how that just manifests, because it's always in the back of your mind, this is going to a certain area. It's like, oh, I remember what happened here. So even though everything has changed, that still is imprinted on your DNA. One of the questions that I had is knowing that Cabrillo was a conquistador, just thinking about that, the iconography of statues, and then like, thinking about the as a conquistador, and then also the relationship with the mission statues or statues to like someone like Junipero Serra. I'm just making a little bit of like a link. And the reason why I mention that is because there was a statue of Padre, and it was also mistaken for Junipero Serra, and it was also vandalized. So it was just very interesting because when you, if there's like if you can speak to it, or if there is an iconography that's associated with mission, such because I'm thinking about the Confederate monuments and the links between that, how things are represented. So
one of the I'm so glad my professor is here, Iris, and one of the things she taught me is that there was a lot going on, and it was very complicated. So there's not one narrative. There's not, often in history, it's painted in black and white. You draw a line, these people were bad, these people were good. One of the things I learned over time, with Iris taught me, is that there was a lot more than just that with the mission history. So the mission history is much more complicated. Cabrillo is pretty easy for me. But when you get to the mission history, it's much more complicated because one of the things that I learned over time is that sometimes there's good people and bad people on both sides, right? And there's a lot of interactions that go on, and those nuances are important. But when it comes to Indian people and how we think about mission history and conquistadors, it's very there's not a lot of controversy going on. we have our minds made up, right? And so when you say Cabrillo was a conquistador, that's very clear what we believe and what we think. And even though he was an explorer when he got here, it doesn't really matter much, right? So it gets to a point where for an Indian person, it's all the same. Spanish colonization is all the same. I believe the word's a metonymy, right? What's the point, the bigger picture. So when we're looking at the Spanish history and the mission history, again, it's very different from an Indian person to a non-Indian person, how we view it. And I think the big reason why Indian people are re-traumatized over and over again is because our voice isn't heard. And that's really the source of our trauma, is that we never have a voice, we never have a platform. And that's why I'm so glad to be here today with my cousin, is that we finally have a voice. This is very special to be here. We're making history, and I'm so happy. And I understand the gravity of what I was doing. So I prepared, and, I did a lot of prayer and all that as well. And I think, but one of the things, I think once we get to a point where we can actually talk and stop arguing, we can find a place where we can say, oh yeah, that Padre was a good guy over there. That was the bad Padre. That was a good Padre. They're not all bad, right? Even though the Padres aren't good right now. But, I mean, yes, all the Padres are bad right now. But, so there's a lot of nuances, and I think as our voice gets more and more equal, then we'll start listening more. So I think, but at this point in time, it's just black and white, right? And so I'm hoping one day where we can understand and the details and nuances of history, so we can actually see how it really was, because it wasn't much different than it is today,
Great, thank you. And one of the things that I was just moving on, and definitely it's a conversation. So if there's something where you're like, hey, like, that was a question for Jason, but I want to answer that one, or same thing for you, Jason. So if there's a question for Ethan, if you wanted to talk to it, definitely feel free. One of the things that I thought was very interesting with the museum space, because when you think about museums, you think of it as just a staid place, a place that is just far removed from the community, but we're calling for museums to be different, to be more of a, it's being called now to be a community institution, and that it's not just top down from the museum administrator or from like a historian, but we have all of this lived, bodied knowledge because we are history, right? And one of the things I thought was very interesting was just because I did have a chance to get out to History Colorado and actually see the exhibit. And it's a two-part question, but thinking about the Post-it notes, something that is so low-tech, but has a great impact. And when I was looking at that, I was thinking about the Vietnam War Memorial and how you have this specific place, granite, that with names like that have so much that's so loaded. So you go there and you have people who have like leave a message that says, by the way, like XYZ happened and you're a grandfather now, and just like so moving. But then thinking about the Post-it notes, something that's so low tech, but that becomes loaded for history. And I wanted to see how is the Post-its, how will the Post-its be used, and how could it inform future exhibits? Well, is there a plan to do that, or can you speak to that?
Well, so I mentioned that after the first few months, we did survey the responses we were getting, and that was the breakdown I shared with you all about generally what the comments were. We've continued to collect them and can reanalyze them to see if anything's changed over time. I was just speaking with one of our guest service staff who every week have to curate what's up there to make sure that there's space for people to leave new comments. I think all of this feedback is helpful for us as we talk about. You mentioned museums are figuring out I think how to be in conversation with our communities more than just how to pontificate at them. And all of that feedback is helpful to us. I think right now where this conversation is, for a long time we installed that monument, and I was like, okay, well, where are all those media organizations that were saying like, these should be in museums? I'm just starting to get the calls from them. It feels like there was a little lag as people wrap their heads around what's going on. And I think that the feedback we are getting isn't really to help us inform new exhibitions. I've spoken with my colleagues in like South Carolina, and they're like, that's great. You guys had one Civil War monument in Colorado. We have like 182. And we can't store them all in a museum. So like it's a different situation, and I'm going to recognize the privileged spot that we're in Colorado in this instance. But I do think that what we are hearing, it was really eye-opening to me that solid majorities of people, at least of the self-selected group that came into our museum and left notes with the little Post-it and the pencil, think that monuments are important. I didn't actually expect that to be such a majority. And so that, I think, is informative of not necessarily what we're going to do in the museum, but this broader conversation that the country is still having and the world is having about what, it's good to re-examine our monuments every once in a while. If we don't, then the monuments aren't serving their purpose because everyone's just walking by them and ignoring them. So we should, every generation, take a look at them and say, hey, is this what we want as the monument? And, I think it's good that we're in that conversation right now. And I think the feedback that we are getting, maybe the channels that didn't exist before for people to provide that feedback, will hopefully inform what we do going forward. And I want to mention here, because I'm in California, one of the great opportunities that we are going to have in our generation to think about what the inclusive history that many of us have been talking about for decades now actually looks like is coming up in 3 years. In 2026, the United States is going to celebrate the 250th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence. It is going to be a very big to-do. You may not know that yet because California is one of the very few states that has not formally engaged in that conversation for reasons that I don't quite understand, because the world could use California in this conversation. So I want to encourage you all to, if you have the ability to think about, how California gets involved or how your local community gets involved in thinking about 2026, it is going to come to us whether we want it to or not. And it is going to be, I would predict, a moment when people talk about a lot of monuments and the new kinds of monuments that we want. And I think it's something, I'm just going to throw this out to all of you. I don't know who's in the audience today, but I hope some of you are able to take this information and maybe act on it here in California, because most of the other states that I'm in touch with are thinking about this, are figuring out how we're going to recognize that the world has changed. This is not the bicentennial in 1976 with tall ships and people dressed up like colonists. But it's an opportunity, and it's one that's going to be squandered if people don't get in the game.
Thank you. And one of the interesting things, I know that we're talking about, of course, talking about monuments, and then also thinking about inclusivity and just the future of monuments in general. I know that you talk to so many different people, and you get 10 people, you get 10 different responses about, are monuments even still needed? If we know that, that later on we're going to find somebody problematic. Or, again, having more, as we have more voices and more people come to the table. Or like Shirley Chisholm would say, if you don't have a seat at the table, bring a chair. But as more voices are being heard, what is can you speak to that voice that says that, do we even need monuments anymore?
Sure. Yeah, I'll pass the mic here in a second, because I'm sure Ethan has something to say about that too. But I think it's a little bit of a false question. Some of the other work I've done in Colorado, we've been looking broadly at all of our named places, mountain peaks and street names in Denver and things like that. Monuments aren't just statues. Monuments, we are swimming in a historical narrative so deeply that we usually don't recognize it. You talk about street names, you talk about building names, you talk about park names, you talk about mountaintops, you talk everything that is named is conveying some sort of story. Sometimes it's an accidental monument, sometimes it's just some guy who was a real estate developer got his name on a neighborhood, but or a street. But a lot of times it was intentionally put there for reasons that get lost to us at some point. There are some street names in Denver that I really think we ought to change. They're not the type of people that we would really want to be naming streets after anymore, but it's very expensive apparently to change all the street signs, and so progress is slow. My point is, I don't think we can talk about not having monuments. This idea, this project, I mean, it's my whole job, right, to take inspiration or knowledge from the past and try and help it make sense of how we got to now in ways that are going to be beneficial as we go forward together. That's what we are doing when we name streets or erect statues. It's all the same project in my mind. And so if you try to come up with names for everything and not use people or movements or organizations, you can only have so many like oak parks or green streets. You just run out, and it's very natural. I mean, when we're talking about removing some of the names from some of these places in Colorado, nobody's saying, "Oh yeah, let's just make it like Pine Mountain." They want to rename it after someone else who they think is more worthy. So it's a perpetuation, and I think it's a natural instinct, and I don't think it's a bad one, but I think it's something that it's better to think constructively about and to be humble in how we think about it, and that maybe people try to create these monuments because they know that nothing lasts forever, and they're trying to thwart that. But nothing does last forever, and we should be open and humble about that, and think about maybe there's a better solution at some point. I don't know if you have anything to add.
Yeah. So I've actually covered this question a little bit in our community, how we feel about monuments. And I'm going to speak on what Bill was going to talk about earlier, how they were going to put a statue here about Balboa in Balboa Park. And there was a talk about it, and Bobby May could speak on it a little bit. Were you there?
No,
No, but you heard about it.
I heard about it.
So anyways, it didn't happen, okay? Spoiler alert. And so and during that conversation, the House of Spain was talking about putting a Balboa statue. My cousin Steve Benegas, I think certain people were there that said no. Balboa, the park said, understood that there wasn't a consensus in our community, and so I remember talking about this particular idea in our community. How do you feel about monuments and statues for indigenous people? And I think it's important to understand a couple of things. First of all, that Indian people are modern and we're different and we evolve, right? So we're not stuck in the past, and we change our minds, So I personally like statues. Okay, I'll just throw it out there. I want a statue. Okay, of Yellow Sky, or we have these old folks right there, these people. He wasn't Kumeyaay, but he was one of us, and he was very important. He's buried in Verona. I thought, hey, why not have a statue of Yellow Sky right there? So you could see what a Kumeyaay person looked like. I thought that would be great instead of everyone looks like a Lakota Apache warrior, right? And that's something. So it would help move the bar with stereotypes. Because people always say, "Oh, you don't look Kumeyaay," right? But they don't know what a Kumeyaay person looks like, So that was where I was at. But before that, I want to mention Crazy Horse. There's a Crazy Horse monument going on right now in South Dakota, right? And Crazy Horse would have never wanted that. He was very humble. He never wanted his picture. And that statue is actually of I think a Ukrainian architect, or the guy who's building it. It's not even after Crazy Horse. So it's a total sham. So when it came to the Balboa statue, I talked to Mike Connolly. He's a friend and mentor of mine as well. And he said that our people don't believe in that. And we don't believe in that. We didn't, right? It's good to understand the historical and that we evolve. But that wasn't something Indian people actually believed in, that you memorialize a person forever in stone. So I think that's where it's important to understand how different religion and worldviews come in, that we're actually operating in a Western worldview when we're talking about monuments and statues. And indigenous worldviews are very different. So I think that's just to complicate it a little more. But again, I want a statue.
Bottom line, statues. And it's so interesting because I was reading another book about identity and how Francis Fukuyama and there's a mention about monuments and how it validates experiences. And it's like, oh no, we're not. You may have evolved from around monuments, but no, this is our lived experience, and we need to have something that bears witness to that. So I think that's it's like, what's your monument? Because it's a bearer of experiences and bearing witness. We do have some time, and we invite you to submit your questions to William. William, raise your hand. And so we'll be able to answer some questions. We'll have about a minute or so, and we'll be able to get to your questions that you have. And while we're getting the questions here, is there anything that I didn't ask that you're like, wait a second, I want to open it up to you, both of you? There's something that came up and you're like, hey, I really want to. Here's a point that I really wanted to make.
I forgot to mention one thing about Spanish history and Indian history, and I think it's important for me to put the first things first when it comes to the monument, right? And I think, in history, it's important not to erase. This is my perspective. I don't believe in erasing history at all. I think history is important. It has lessons. I think it's important to remember what happened and why we are the way we are. Because if without some of those indicators, you wonder where you got here. Who am I? Right? The ultimate question. So I'm not about erasing Spanish history either. But I think it needs to be in its right place, and we need to put the first things first. And I understand that, there was a movement earlier to put a Kumeyaay statue, and there was. Do you want to speak on this, Iris?
I could.
Could you?
I don't know if people actually understand why that statue is there.
Can I invite Iris to talk? Is that okay? Yeah. Here.
Okay, the statue that is out on the grounds of the Cabrillo Monument had really nothing to do with the Spaniards. It's after there was a controversy with the Portuguese, and the Portuguese felt that Cabrillo was Portuguese and not Spanish, and it's really not settled totally. He might have had Portuguese ancestors, who knows? We don't know exactly. But anyway, the Portuguese were really determined to put some kind of a statue up there, and they found that there was going to be a statue at the World's Fair in San Francisco, but it was going to be in Oakland. So in 1933, 3 men, one of whom was Ed Fletcher, and a couple of other Portuguese people went up to Oakland and stole the statue. And they took it and they hid it in a garage of a fellow Portuguese person in the area. They finally packed it up and brought it down to the Cabrillo National Monument, and they drove out there, and the superintendent of the Cabrillo Monument says, "What are we supposed to do with this?" And they said, "You got to put it up somewhere." Well, they said, "We don't have any place to put the statue, and we don't want to put a statue." So the whole Portuguese society in Point Loma kept saying, no, it deserves to go up. So they put the statue up there on the hill where you all see it, with no regard to the indigenous viewpoint, no regard to the Spanish viewpoint, nobody's viewpoint except this group of Portuguese people that wanted to get that statue. So the Cabrillo National Monument, my very close friend was superintendent for 8 years and just retired a couple of years ago. And he said, with all the crisis, and we never did, we tried to get the Kumeyaay to come out there and give their appointment or their point of view, but they never could. So now the people at the Cabrillo Monument, if you want to take the statue down, fine. It's so controversial, and they don't think it's fair to have this big statue of Cabrillo, allegedly Cabrillo, and have no statue from the Kumeyaay or nothing that honors the Kumeyaay. And he had 3 conferences with the Kumeyaay Indians, and no one could ever agree what they wanted. And so it ended up, and I have the history, the records of the Cabrillo Monument. So they would be happy if the Indians, and if they want to object, there's no reason why they shouldn't. I mean, it's kind of a monument to the conquest of the indigenous people. So they'd be willing to take it down. So if you want me to pursue this further, just let me know.
Thank you.
Point well made. Thank you. So we are kind of coming close on time. So if you want to ask a question.
Can I ask a question to get it on record?
Okay.
All right. So do I need one of those?
Absolutely.
Hey, world. San Diego is America's finest city, right? So we say. It is a beautiful city, and we have great things here. We have different everythings, and San Diego is really progressive. We know this. The San Diego mission statement is, we provide a fiscally sound, effective government that is responsible and dependable, a safe, well-maintained, and healthy environment, and abundant opportunities so our residents and visitors can enjoy the highest quality of life. So my question is, do you think San Diego's ready for this with their mission statement just being read? And do you think California's ready for this? And that's for all of you.
Oh, thank you for asking that question. And we are at a moment of time where I call it the grand reckoning, because we're thinking about monuments, and as not even like just thinking about monuments, but what do they represent, right? Because we're seeing that it is that they represent, they become the avatar for different social injustices. The example that always comes to mind is the J. Marion Sims statue. While he was heralded as the father of modern gynecology, he did a lot of his experiments on enslaved African women to perfect using the fish oil, without anesthesia, and what does that even represent now? Because you're thinking about the Black maternal health crisis, and how that reverberates throughout time of who we're honoring. But I think that, and forgive me if I'm answering that question. But I think we're at a time where we're open to talk about it. And there are so many things that happen throughout history that we wouldn't have been able to say 50 years ago, and even approach, or even have a forum to discuss it. So I hope I'm answering your question. Kind of. But now we've got it on the record, but there are some things that we're just having these conversations about. We're kind of at time, and I'm going to we do have some time, but I'm going to try to get to 2 questions that were asked, and we will have a reception afterwards where you'll be more than able to ask any less questions and have a great conversation. So one of the, do you have anything to add before I shift over? Okay, so one of the questions that we received from the audience was, as a Kumeyaay, I see a lot of Spanish representation, so I'm wondering, where is ours? What efforts are being made to make that happen?
That's got to be you.
You're on, man. I think this goes with your point, right? Are we ready for representing our people? I teach at San Diego State. I have 130 students this year, which is a lot for me. I'm always around non-Indian people, teaching them our history. And by far, I'm always blown away at people's receptiveness. This generation, I think, is ready. I think it's a generational thing, right? And I think sometimes things take time, and you have to be patient, and you have to wait for the tides to turn and generations to evolve. But I think especially with so much information going on with, not just George Floyd and Black Lives Matter, but with Dakota Access Pipeline protests where Bobby was at, protesting the installation of the pipeline over the water of the Lakota people. So I'm absolutely aware that we are ready. I believe that we're ready. And I think the representation, maybe like Iris mentioned, is something like us coming together as maybe the 12 Kumeyaay bands coming together and funding a new statue where the Cabrillo statue is, that represents the first people who were here first. And so I would hope that, and I hope that comes not just from our community, but from the outside community as well, because then it would mean so much more if everyone wanted that. So that's really why education is key, and teaching people the history, which takes a lot of time. So.
Great, thank you. So we just have one more question, and then we'll conclude. But kind of picking up from where you left off, one of the questions that we did have was, when we consider how many elements contribute to the chosen U.S. grand historical narrative, 4th grade curriculum, place names, monuments, how do we use the monuments conversation to make meaningful change across disciplines?
Just a easy question to end on. So the question was, there's so much that goes into this conversation about American identity, whatever that means. How do we think about monuments and all the other components of it in a way that can start to make change? If I knew that, I'd probably be somewhere other than at a history museum. But my thought is, as I think about this 250th anniversary that's coming up for the United States, the answer, I think the most tenable answer, the answer that people are ready for, is to build a bigger container to hold what it means to be an American. It's not, history is almost always a contest over identity. What is our identity collectively? And typically it's been perceived as something close to a zero-sum game. We're going to have the Spanish, not the Portuguese. We're going to have the colonists, not the indigenous identity represented. And maybe I'm naive, but I've been thinking about this for decades, and I cannot come up with a reason why we can't think of it as more expansive, an abundance mindset about identity rather than a scarcity mindset. And, I think if we need to build more monuments, let's think about how we can broaden the stories we're telling with those. Just a quick example of one way that this can work. Another type of monument is historic places, right? The places that we preserve to tell stories, like this beautiful park that we are in right now and all of these buildings. In Colorado, we did a survey of our state historic register, and it is not going to shock you to learn that about 4% of the places on that register were related to BIPOC communities or women, which means that 96% were white guys' places. So for this 250th, for 2026, Colorado is the centennial state. You might not know that out here in the Bear Republic, but that means that we became a state on the 100th anniversary of the Revolution, so 1876. Which means we're celebrating our 150th anniversary in Colorado as the nation celebrates its 250th. So we're going to add 150 sites to the historic register pertaining to BIPOC communities. And that's enough to move the needle, not all the way, but to something closer to reducing white men's presence to 90%. But it's moving in that direction. And I think we don't have to subtract stories. We just need to tell more and better stories. Maybe one day we'll do a little bit of curating about which stories we're telling, but that's the part that I'm not sure people are ready for. So unless you want a fight all the time about subtracting these stories, and there are some that we are and we're willing to fight for, but we don't have to do this in a reductive way. I think we can do it in an expansive way. That would be my suggestion.
Awesome. Yeah, there's a poem. I was having issues when I was younger, and I asked my pastor, because people were always not including me in their ideas, right? And I think he's a Russian poet, and he said, when you drew your circle, you drew me out, but when I draw my circle, I draw you in. And that's really how I view the world and how I view history. And I think I'm always drawing everyone in my circle, because the worst thing to feel is being left out. And that voice is what matters to me. And so really that's like my philosophy when it comes to life and history. Yeah.
Thank you so much for your great insight. So this concludes our discussion session, but I did want to invite Doug Comer for the closing statements. After this, we do have a reception, and we'd like to continue the conversation. And thank you again for being here. And Doug, would you like to come?
I need one of those for the record. Oh, okay, great, thanks.
Oh, this was a lot. And don't you want
don't have a lot to add to this fantastic content that we've just heard. Really, really thought-provoking. I just want to mention a couple of things. I want to thank Sakina, of course, and her incredible group of people that work with her. And meeting them in person, I haven't had that chance to do most of the time, but we've been meeting virtually like every week for a very long time, so it's wonderful to see them all. So Sakina, of course, who's unbelievable, and Miles. Elizalo, William Humphrey, Gilbert Carrera, and Destiny Hurd. Those have been her stalwart people working with her. Also, I want to mention the summer researchers, Maddie Bonner, Charlotte Jones, Ariana Vercelli, Henry Zhang, Misty Crooks, Kim Lifton, Laura Mifoli, Becca Journey, and Janelle Amy. And our speakers. So thank you so much, Jason and Ethan. Thank you. I can't read I could never learn how to write. All right, but I will say this. When I was growing up, I went from the East Coast to the West Coast. My sister's in the audience, so she went through this with me. And I would learn American history. And, you go in the East, you would expect, you hear about the colonists and the founding fathers and the Declaration of Independence and all the very wonderful sorts of things. And then you'd come out to the West Coast in California, and I'd read the same things, right? But there's this mindset that always bothered me, which is like, to Easterners, the West Coast was just this blank slate. We brought all the ideas in our forms of government and our mercantile exchange. We brought it all with us, and then we just discovered, wow, there's all this empty land over to the west. We'll just take it. It's like there's nothing there already. Well, guess what? There was something there already, and that's what we've been talking about. But I don't think people in the East still understand that. The history of the founding fathers, for example, is very fraught, has come to light recently. You can find fault with what a lot of them did. And it's very difficult. We're trying to decode that and understand it and live with it and correct it and all of that. But the history right here is just as complex. And you're dealing with the same issues. And I don't really think that the population in the East is fully aware of that. This is part of what has made us. It should also be a part of what we want to become. So what we're talking about here, happening in San Diego, Colorado, I mean, people back east, they don't know about the Battle of Glorieta Pass or Shivington or any of that stuff. They know about Robert E. Lee and, Grant. It's really important that we continue this conversation here in the West and tie it all together so that we understand we're all going through the same soul searching and searching for a way forward that's a way forward together, telling all our stories and coming up with something that's better than what we've been living with right now. So anyway, I thank you all for having me here, and I've really enjoyed this, and I really want to continue to stay in touch with everybody in this room. So thank you so much. Wonderful job.
Again, I wanted to thank everybody for being a part of Monument Summer. This is, just to give you some background, this is a global conversation, a conversation that's greater than what's happening within these four walls today. Our first event was in Charleston, South Carolina, where we're at Mother Emanuel Church, and talking about what do monuments mean, what can happen, where do we go from here, how do we take concrete actions to really think about, again, what are the root causes, the root of what these monuments represent, and how do we take the conversation a step forward for something that's concrete that can enact positive change in society. And again, with this conversation today, again, continuing about monuments, so what are the effects, and how do we even begin to, how these monuments can be a facilitating mechanism to process trauma, which is really big, because generation trauma is real, and how can that be a mechanism to shed light on and address these great issues. Again, this is something much greater than ourselves. This is we want to have more conversations that will, again, enact positive change, and this will be a series of conversations out of many. So I always say this is not the first one because it has been happening. But again, I do hope to see everyone again. If you want to follow us, www.worldheritageusa.org. Also, I wanted to, again, thank our panelists, Ethan Menegas, and also Jason Hansen. Thank you so much for being here today. And I want to thank the San Diego History Center for having us be able to be here today. And also wanted to thank the Mellon Foundation for your generous support, because without your support, we would not be able to do the work that we're doing. Again, thank you so much. Definitely do please stay in touch. And if you have, please give us the information if you want to be on our mailing list. We do have refreshments that's out in the atrium, and you're more than welcome to join. And we'll keep this conversation going. Thank you so much, and everyone have a safe trip home. Thank you.